Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my guest, Master Paul. And
Hello.
today we're going to discuss Kiss Part 1, covering the years of 1973 to 1980.
hmm
And we will have three other follow ups to cover the whole career of Kiss. And when I refer to career of Kiss, I'm talking albums. I'm not going to. We're
Yes.
not going to go into details of other things involving the band. Pretty much, we're going to try to stick with the studio albums and Alive 1 and 2.
hmm
So, with that being said, let's start out with the very first Kiss album, Kiss.
Yep. Oh. So, full disclosure, us covering Kiss was my idea. We were initially, hello, Baron, saying Bee Gees
That
are better
guy.
than Kiss. And, oh, look who else we have here. Oh, we have the Phantom
It's
Booligan.
that guy. We got
Yep,
hooligans.
we
Hooligans.
do. But anyways, as I was saying, and Orca just popped in the chat.
Yes. Baby Shamu.
hmm Yeah, what Cash just said in the chat. Hooligan. No, it's Booligans. Crit said it, and we all know that Crit is the pushing man, right?
He is the pushing man.
Yeah. All right. So back to what I was saying though. Initially, so we've done a stream like this already. We talked about Black Sabbath, and we were gonna follow that up with Deep Purple. I tried listening to Deep Purple and honestly couldn't even get through the first album, but we will still do Deep Purple at some point, Phil, I promise. But having hearing Phil talk so much about Kiss, I decided to go search out the first album and I listened to it, and I knew that this is where this sort of music band discussion thing that we've been doing over here on this channel, this is where it should go next. So the first album is still, having now heard everything that the original lineup did together, I would say the first album is still my favorite because it's it's the one that sets the standard. Like, okay, here's Kiss. Here are these four weird looking dudes in all this black and white and some red makeup, and they're singing just straight up rock and roll songs about being in love with women. I mean, what more could you ask for, right?
Well, I would say and agree with you. The first album, along with any other band's first album, normally is their identifier.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, what involves with this first album, okay, two things. One thing, Paul Stanley, for 1 month, changed his makeup without the star and used the bandit makeup. He only did it for a month
Mm-hmm.
and never did it again. So technically, when it comes to the original members, Paul Stanley had two versions of his makeup: the bandit, and then he went back to the star. Uh,
Right, which I don't believe I've actually seen him as the star. So let me see if I can
you mean the
find that.
bandit?
The bandit. Okay?
And as you're looking for that, uh, there's another thing to note. In the original pressing of the very first album, and it's only the first 2 months pressing, there's a
Mm-hmm.
track, Kissing Time. It's not on the original first pressing. The original first pressing album had in the center of the record, had a camel and a,
hold
yep,
on, hold on, hold on. We got someone important here.
Yeah.
Kiss. Man, you should listen to a real band. PJ Strassner and the White Cable of
Wait a
Death.
minute. Which is this, Coach or Nick?
That's got to be Coach. Nick is never the one to tease me about my headphone
Okay.
cable.
Well, you know what? He is from Alabama, so we'll excuse him. We'll excuse
Yeah.
him. We'll let it slide. Yeah. But yeah, that's the infamous bandit makeup. He only wore it for a month, and then he went back
Yeah,
to a star.
the star definitely suits him better.
The thing about the first album, like I said, there's a song called "Kissing Time." It's on the second side. Originally, that was not included on the album. 2 months later, the head of Casablanca had Kiss record it and then put it on the album. Then there's a third pressing that they did later in the 80s, and somebody at Mercury who ended up buying Casablanca
Mm-hmm.
took the Nothing to Lose track and put a live version from Alive and replaced the studio track, and no one knew it for the longest time. So if you have the original Kiss Kiss album without Kissing Time, that's a lot of money. If
Wow.
you have the Kiss album, the very first album with Nothing to Lose as the live track instead of the studio track, that's also a collector's item. Them three versions there are Kiss fans. The first one's a diamond, it's hard to find. But
Mm-hmm.
ideally the diehard Kiss fans want everything. And
Right.
so them three versions of the Kiss Kiss album, they're the ones they look for. I have two. I don't have the original without Kissing Time, but I do have the original, say, second pressing, and then the follow up Mercury version of the third pressing with the live track instead of the studio track of Nothing to Lose.
Right.
So,
But I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, Phil. So let's go back and talk about where Kiss actually started. So this all started really with another band called Wicked Lester, which Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were a part of with two other guys, correct? And they
actually,
tried to go,
there was three other guys.
three other guys, okay.
Correct.
And,
Wicked Lester did have a album.
mm-hmm.
You can see it and listen to it on YouTube. Has a lot of Kiss songs that were recorded way different to what you will hear on a Kiss album. But it was done under Epic, I believe, Epic Records, and Kiss wasn't happy with it. So when Kiss left Epic Records, well, Wicked Lester, they broke the deal, which they were lucky they were able to do, but they managed somehow to have that album shelved for a
Right.
good almost 20 some years. So nobody got to hear it, see it, or heard it. So, yeah. If you go on the, like I said, YouTube, there's a copy of the record that was eventually released. And you can hear some of the early versions of these Kiss songs in a more, how can I put it nicely, hippie-ish style of Kiss. So, yeah. But yeah, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons had control of Wicked Lester, and when they fired everybody, or however you want to put it, it was just them two. So they decided to go. They wanted a 4-man band, and they had an idea of what they wanted, what was going to be Kiss to become.
Right. So at what point? So let me ask you this, because I don't think this is something we've discussed. At what point did the makeup come along? Was it right there from the word go, like from the day one of Kiss being formed, or did they do some shows without the makeup and then tried it on and be like, boom, this works?
The first four, the original four, when they formed and got together, They were more, you would call it a drag type band, which means is they dressed in drag. There was a band in New York known as the New York Dolls. They were very popular up in New York,
Hmm.
and the early version of what you want to call Kiss tried to imitate them, and they did kind of drag. And there's pictures of early Kiss in them drag outfits.
Let me see if I
Well,
can find one.
go ahead, and I'll continue as you're doing it. Uh, as they were touring, doing the clubs, a mime group had been in there and they left their makeup. And that's really technically it's not makeup, it's grease paint. So they decided to put on the grease paint. And originally they were all white bases. And then later on they start eventually evolving the makeup to what almost you see today.
I'm not
So
finding any pictures of that, by the way, so I'll take your word for it.
yeah. So when the album Kiss Kiss was getting ready to come out, uh, the head of Casablanca Records really didn't want Kiss to be in makeup. Kiss kept insisting that they're going to stay in makeup, even up to the taking pictures for the album. When you look at the pictures of the album, the only one I know of is the actual pictures you see. But supposedly there is a picture out there of them not in makeup for what would have been the cover of the album if they decided to take the makeup off.
Right.
Another thing to notice is Ace Frehley's grease paint on that. I don't know what type of silver he was using that day, but he got really sick. I think he was using a similar grease paint. If you
You
look
don't
at
think it
the
would have?
album cover,
You don't think it
that
would have had like mercury in it, would it?
it was the same one that the Tin Man, they got the original Tin Man.
Oh,
Yeah,
no.
sick. So he got sick after putting that makeup on. And if you notice, Peter Chris's makeup, the cat makeup, is
Mhm.
different. And for some reason, they had a professional do his makeup instead of his traditional cat one that he does.
Right?
And they paid a lot of money for this person to go in there and do his makeup. If you look at the album cover, his makeup is uh not normal.
Right. But as far as the songs themselves, though, they are they are really good, and I would say the best one of all of them, at least for me, is the first one, Strutter, with Cold Gin being probably a good number two for me. And overall, we did it with the Sabbath albums. I'm going to do it again here. If I was to give this album a score out of 10, I'm going to say 8 out of 10 for the first one.
I will agree with 8 out of 10. For me, Black Diamond stands out. And I will agree that most of the tours and following tours with different versions of Kiss, most of the songs they play comes off this first album.
Right.
So
So after
eight
that,
out of ten.
yep, and then after that came Hotter Than Hell.
Hotter than hell. And if you notice, you'll see a trend with early Kiss. Albums are coming out within sometimes 4 to 6 months from each other. Hotter Than Hell came out, I think, 6 months after the title album, and
Which
again
how
in
did they which
1974.
how did they have time to tour on that first album
It
and then
was
record that within
out
six
the way
months?
that they did it in the early days. It was album, tour, couple weeks in the studio, back to touring, album, couple weeks, tour, and back into this. It was
Still,
a lot of wear and tear. So to
and well,
give them props, because I don't know many bands that can do sometimes two or more albums in a year. They
yeah,
did it,
and we'll
and
see the
utter
consequences of that when we get
wear and
later
tear
on
towards
in
the
the
end. Yep.
later albums of this stream.
Hotter Than Hell is a very unique album cover. They
Mhm.
have the same producers that they had with the title album Kiss. Uh, The unique thing of the back of the album, unique. I'll just say people will have to look that up and see what I mean by unique. The
Yep.
one thing to notice is that there's images of Ace Frehley or pictures of him,
Mm-hmm.
and he kind of had the Mark Hamill incident where he was involved in that car accident. It
Ooh,
damaged, it cut his face,
that ain't
and
good.
he could only put his makeup on half of his face, and they had to airbrush the rest of his makeup on.
Right. Okay. And by the
So,
way, are you going to say hello to your favorite person?
who, Leia Rose? That's the princess. Hello,
Yep.
princess.
Oh, and by the way, guys, let's get this trending real quick. I'm gonna put it in. I'm gonna put it in the chat here. And by the way, I am helping control Phil's chat. But I want to see this get trending. Hashtag Phil is a good guy because he is.
No,
He
don't
is
do
a good
that.
guy.
No. I hate you all. But Hotter Than Hell, to me, out of the first three albums, to me, is an album that stands the test of time. The sound quality to me on that album is superior than I would say the first six studio albums.
I
Okay.
would disagree with that
I can
personally.
understand that. Uh, I would say, as a semi Kiss fan and as maybe a somewhat Kiss fan, Hotter Than Hell would be, I would say, an album to have than Kiss Kiss, the title album,
See,
to
for
me.
me, yeah, and that's fair enough. But for me, I saw Hotter Than Hell as an ever so slight step down from the first album. Like, to me, everything that you just said about Hotter Than Hell, as far as being an album that, as far as sound quality goes, stands the test of time, to me, that's the first album that fits that description. Hotter Than Hell is not bad by any stretch of the means. But to me, the first one is just that much better. So my ranking out of 10 for Hotter Than Hell, if I gave the first one an 8 out of 10, I'm going to give Hotter Than Hell a 7.5. And I would say the title track's probably my favorite one.
Okay. For myself, I would rank it 8.5.
Hmm.
And I love all the tracks, but if I had to pick one, Strange Ways is my favorite song off that track, off that album.
They named that one accurately because it does have a
Yeah.
strange sound to it.
So, moving on, and there's a lot more to move on. Dress
Hmm.
to Kill.
Yep. It's
Uh,
also it's also worth noting, I think at this point in the stream, that even though, yes, Paul Stanley is the quote unquote front man of the group, he does not do all of the lead singing. They actually split it up between all four members. Now, granted, it's not an even split. Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons do the vast bulk of it, but Peter Criss, the drummer, has his songs that he sings. Um, which album did Mainline come off of? Is it Dress to Kill or
Hotter
Hotter Than
Than
Hell?
Hell. Hotter Than
Yeah,
Hell.
he sang that one,
Yeah.
and
And he
he
sung
did a good
Strange
job.
Ways with that album.
And
But Ace
then,
Frehley later on does sing. But
yeah,
here on these first five studio albums, Ace Frehley doesn't sing. It's pretty much the other three. And you'll notice, especially on the first three, somewhat on the next two,
hmm
Peter Chris's role as in the band, far as like in the studio, you'll
hmm
see him get two, maybe three songs here and there.
but he starts to
He's
diminish.
really a force in the band at this time, which later on, unfortunately, we'll see his role diminished.
Yes,
So, but at this point, you could say his contributions to the band is just as equal as Paul Stanley's. and Gene Simmons.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
Ace Frehley, by the way, is an amazing guitarist. Okay, so I remember several months ago on like a Skyrim stream or something, Phil, you and I and Ian, my friend, were having an argument about who the best guitarist in the world is, and somehow we had come up with the argument of who the best rhythm guitarist is, and myself and Ian were both arguing for James Hetfield of Metallica being the best rhythm guitarist. You were arguing against that, saying that Paul Stanley was. And now, having listened to all of these albums, and I know we have more to come, I see why.
and another thing that's going to be a future trend, which isn't now with this Kiss as we're going through their catalog.
Mm-hmm.
Each member is playing their instrument. Each member is doing their part.
Right, like that's
Which,
actually Ace Frehley doing the solo. That's
yeah,
actually Peter Criss doing the drums, etc.,
right.
etc.
Uh, in the future, we're going to see that change in a bit, and not for the better.
Yeah.
But going to Dress to Kill, there's a unique cover on there. You'll
Mm-hmm.
see four of them dressed in uh,
Three-piece suits.
three-piece suits.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Criss is the only one that actually owned a three-piece suit. The
Really?
other three had to borrow Bill Alcoin, their manager, suits and shoes from him.
Wow.
So when you see that album, the only man there that had shoes and a suit was good old Peter Criss.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was pictures were taking of them in the streets of New York. You'll see him on the street corner when you see the album cover. The
Right.
back is unique of the album. It's a negative of the front.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
So,
I do like Dress to Kill. Uh, I wouldn't say it's better than the first two. I
yeah,
would
I would
even go ahead.
I
I'm
would
sorry.
say I would say Dress to Kill for me. I'm gonna go ahead and give this one also an 8 out of 10. Although I do actually, you know what? I'm gonna retroactively make the first album an 8.5. That way I can make Dress to Kill an 8 because I do like Dress to Kill almost as much as I like the first album, but I do still like the first album better. And this is the album that has those. Okay, go to any person and ask them to name one Kiss song, just one. And I guarantee you the vast majority of the time they're going to name I Want to Rock and Roll All Night and Party Every Day. That song is on Dress to Kill. So for that reason alone, this album is worth a listen, wouldn't you say, Phil?
Yes, and you have to remember the more famous one is the live version of that song.
Yes.
Uh, I will give this a rating as an 8. I like this album, but it is different than the first two. I see this more. They're still heavy, but I seen this almost a little bit turned down a little bit. They're
Yeah.
not as heavy as the first two albums. Not that
Which
it isn't heavy. I just think it got turned down a little bit for Dress to Kill.
which let's talk about that for a second, the heaviness of the band. I definitely agree that I wouldn't necessarily say that Dress to Kill is less heavy, but the production is more polished, which unintentionally takes away from the heaviness. But I did want to mention that through this whole experience of me listening to these albums so far, right off the back of listening to Black Sabbath, I couldn't help but, I have enjoyed all of these albums, but at the same time, that Kiss, these albums have kind of taken their time to grow on me. Whereas Black Sabbath, with them being objectively heavier, they had me from the word go. So it's definitely worth mentioning. Yes, Kiss is heavy, but there was heavier stuff back in those days, most notably Black Sabbath. Like, the first album came out in what, 73? Was it?
For Black Sabbath,
No, for Kiss.
73 is the first album.
Yeah, 73, if I'm not mistaken, Sabbath was putting out Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, having already put out their in my opinion, their heaviest album, period, of Master of Reality.
It's a funny thing you bring that up because around this time, if I remember correctly, Kiss actually opens up for Black Sabbath, but only lasts 4 concerts, and then they were kicked off
What?
because Kiss was out doing the live. They were the opening act, not just
Mhm.
Black Sabbath. Every time they would open up, there would be actually more people going to see Kiss than they were seeing the headliners.
I know Blue Oyster Cult was one of them because they mentioned that in Detroit Rock
Yeah,
City.
they were. And by this time, by this album, Kiss is getting out of the mode of being the opening act and just about going to be headliners.
Hmm.
So, and the funny thing, a lot of the people that had, and then 2 years had been headlining and had Kiss as the opening act, the reverse is going to be happening, and they're going to be head opening for Kiss.
Yeah,
So
which
yeah,
is mind blowing.
but
Which I
yeah,
think is a good transition into the first of the live albums, Kiss Alive. I remember listening to this the first time. I was going down the road, and the one thing that stood out to me was the audience in the recording. You know how in most live albums, there will be a period of, the audience cheering on the song, but then they'll be quiet kind of and let the band play. No, the audience in Kiss Alive, and I'm not saying, and the audience in Kiss Alive just did not shut up, and that's a good thing.
Paul, I'm going to crush you. I want you to prepare yourself. Okay,
Okay.
grab a pillow in case you might need this.
Okay.
Kiss Alive, even though it was recorded at 3 different live performances,
What?
Kiss recorded some of that in a studio.
What?
Yes.
So that's not a real concert.
No, it's a real concert, but here's what they did. Back then in the day, you had a lot of feedback from amplifiers, guitars were plugged in, mistakes were made. So they went into a studio and polished their live tracks. So, in a sense, it is a live album, but it's been polished up with studio performances.
Wow.
So it's not technically what would you call a live album. Okay.
That is shocking.
I'm going to tell you this right now. Uh, Live albums were not a great thing back in the day. All right.
Hmm.
They were not. The first band pretty much noted for doing a live album is Deep Purple.
Right.
Now, I can't speak on Deep Purple how authentic their live album, Live from Japan, was. But I can tell you this: every so called live album, not just by Kiss, but by anybody, has used the same template.
Hmm.
Take a live track and overdub it with studio. Like they said, and I understand it. You don't want to hear a mistake. You don't want to hear feedback from a guitar, you know?
So, okay,
So,
so again, drawing from the last discussion that we did like this, so Live Evil, the Dio live album, that was overdubbed with studio performances.
yep. They all did it. They all
Wow.
did it. Uh, if you want an authentic live album, you get a bootleg or when bands actually issue after the concert, a lot of them do them now, they issue a copy of what you just went to. And that's an authentic live album.
Okay.
Okay. I know it's very shocking and very
Well, hold on. One more thing I want to ask about this, and
good.
then we'll get back to the album itself. Does that also apply to video live performances? Like, say they put out a VHS or a DVD of a
No,
live
no,
performance.
no. The video of you seeing a live concert, even if you're going back into the early '70s and such, that is what you see is what's going on in the concert.
Okay, had to make
Okay,
sure.
but a live one is parts of three separate concerts. They took the best tracks and they went into the studio and polished it up. Now, I am not, don't hold me to this, but in a live, I believe Peter Chris's drums are more, he had to do the less work. The other three had to do more polishing.
Okay,
So, but again, that's not, I can't say confirmed, but that's a lot of people's belief. And yeah, the drumming is, if there's any part of the Kiss Alive album that's authentic, it's the drumming from Peter Criss.
which sounds phenomenal on
Mhm.
this album, which
Yeah.
again really irritates me that they don't maintain that through the rest of their
There's
career.
there's something real quick we have to point out.
Hmm.
Alive put Kiss on the map, and if you
Right.
go, Alive really sold good. The first three albums did not sell that good, but after Alive came out, people went back to the first three records and managed to increase the sales to where they got gold standards. So the first three albums after Alive came out did manage to make gold. Now
Yes.
here's where you run into the problem. Alive. Is it a 3 million? Is it a 4 million? Is it a 5 million? Is it a 6 million copy platinum record? Here, officially, when you hear the RICC, that's the people that keep track of album sales, they will tell you Kiss Alive sold 3 million copies. Okay.
Right.
Again, here's the problem 1975, we didn't have a scanner in all the stores. A scanner was rare. The big stores had it, but the small department stores, the record stores, your mom and pops did not have a scanner. Okay.
Hmm.
So keeping track of how many albums got sold, it's very questionable. But going by what was had been printed, and even to this day, the albums being sold and remastered and everything, you can say Kiss Alive is definitely a $4 or $5 million, or not million copies sold because of the remakes, the remasters, the reissues, and what was sold at the time. Though officially it says 3 million, I really believe it's more 5, maybe even 6 million that's been sold to this day.
Hmm.
And other records will also reflect that. That not just for Kiss, that's for everybody. Like I said, you have to put yourself in that time. Baron can probably tell you just as much as I am. We didn't have a price scanner. You didn't have a little thing where the cashier ran your barcode and it went beep. That all had to be put in manually with your finger like a typewriter.
Right.
So somebody had to put 9.99. The receipt went to you, and a copy of the receipt went into the cash register. So the
Yes.
people keeping track of the album sales really couldn't say what was sold. Most of the time, what they tried to do is how many records were printed and delivered to the record companies or the distributors of records, which
Right.
is very hard to maintain and acknowledge. So.
But getting back to the album itself, though, Alive is definitely one of the better live albums that I've ever heard. It's not my favorite. That is still Petra's Captured in Time and Space, which we'll talk about Petra later on. But this is still a good album. I would give it. You know what? No, I'm not going to give it. I'm not going to give it a score out of 10. I'm going to save those for the studio albums. But I do recommend it.
Okay. For me, I will give it a 9 out of 10 because of the significance of the album and how much of an impact it had. Like I said, up until that time, a lot of bands and a lot of record companies did not want a live album.
Right.
After this is where you get Peter Frampton Comes Alive. Other bands, start flooding. Now there have been other bands that have did a live album.
Mm-hmm.
Deep Purple live in Japan, for example. But
Right.
this was the template that later bands used from here on out. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And so next came Destroyer. And Destroyer, when I first heard it at least, was a pretty significant step down from both Dress to Kill and Alive, because the sound, as far as like what the music wanted to be, was just a tad too all over the place. Like, what sort of music was God of Thunder? Which ironically is my favorite one from that album.
Well, I will try to give you as much as I can explanations on this album. First of all, there is the true cover, which didn't get put on. On a. It's called Destroyer Resurrected. It was
Mm-hmm.
just released maybe about 10-15 years ago.
Yeah.
And it has a different cover than the original one that we have. And the difference
Right.
is slight painting of it, but the outfits, they're in their live outfits, but
Mm-hmm.
they made the guy who did the painting redo it with the new outfits they would have for Destroyer and the tour.
Right.
Okay.
And
Uh,
it's sadly also worth mentioning that this is the first chink in the armor as
yeah.
far as all four members doing their thing, because the song Sweet Pain, Ace Frehley on the final record doesn't play. He did a recording, but for some boneheaded reason, the producer of that album hated Ace Frehley's playing and brought in someone else to do it.
I
And you
believe
had
his
to and
name
you had to have
is
imagined that Ace himself had to have been angry about that.
I believe his name is Dick Wagner. He was
Yeah.
the guitarist for Alice Cooper, who
Hmm.
Ezrin had recorded a couple albums with Alice Cooper. That's why Kiss wanted him, Bob Ezrin, as the producer. I will tell you, as a Kiss fan from this era and people at that time, this album was the first album where some diehard Kiss fans then were not a fan of this album.
Hmm.
More people outside the diehard Kiss fans enjoy Destroyer. Okay. Now, I happen to like Destroyer, but I can see the point of view where some diehard fans back in that day did not like the production of that album. It just didn't. So thankfully, and it took years, we did get the release of Sweet Pain with Ace Frehley, so people can compare the original version with the ghost guitarist and the Ace Frehley playing with his solo on there. And I will say this: Ace Frehley's version is way better. Nothing against the
Agreed.
guitarist that did it on Sweet Pain on the studio album, but I don't see how you could have took Ace Frehley off of that and say that playing was bad. I don't see it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was just bad.
Yes, but this is like you said. This is the first time a chink in the armor where you see Kiss was doing their thing, all members doing their thing, and now you get okay. We don't need Ace. Go ahead, go home. This guy's going to come in and play for you. Now you get what they would call session players coming in. This is where it starts. And as Kiss fans, it is very painful because not just Destroyer, but a lot of the albums that fall, you know, after the original band, where you're going to see almost an epidemic of session players. So, but this is where it starts. Uh,
So
as
for this
far as,
album,
go ahead, you rate first.
yeah, so for this album, again, I do like it, and listening to it the second time around actually did help it. Now that I kind of knew what to expect and can appreciate it as it is, I still say it is something of a departure from at least what they established as the early Kiss sound. And so I'm giving this album a low 7 out of 10.
Gotcha. For me, I do like the album. I see exactly what people's complaints are and acknowledge them. I will give it a 7 out of 10. And, you know, it's for a lot of people, it's a must have out of the Kiss collection.
Mhm.
But I love a lot of the songs on there. But for me, as an album as a whole, uh, the production is what causes me not to like the album. So 7 out of 10, still good, but it could have been better. And
Yes.
essentially, I guess we can leave it at that for that album.
Yep. So next is Rock and Roll Over. And Baron saying hashtag Phil corrupts Paul. And of course the Phantom Bulligan saying, "Are you listening to that devil music again?" Okay,
Mm,
can we mention this whole backlash just briefly? Can we mention the whole backlash that Kiss was having around this time?
with the backlash, with I don't know what are you talking about? So you got
Basically, people calling them the devil's music and such.
okay. And look, when Kiss start becoming big, and especially on some of the like the Merv Griffin, they're not the Merv Griffin. There was another guy before Merv Griffin. Uh, when Kiss was on TV and people seen that image, and especially Gene Simmons,
Yeah.
they seen the demon
Mm-hmm.
projected that automatically they were
Making this
devil
face.
worshippers. You know, uh, they believed Kiss stood for Knights in Satan's service and all this other stuff. Okay, uh, let's break it down. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley are Jewish. Okay, Ace Frehley is a guy from another planet, but he wears crosses. Okay.
Yeah.
Peter Chris has tattoos and more crosses. Has things. He's Catholic. He's
Right.
Italian. What do you expect? Look, this is where I will say it real quick. What a performer, an artist doesn't necessarily reflect who they are or what they believe as individual.
Right. It's
You're
clear
not going
that.
to punish somebody for playing in a movie as Dracula and think that he is the devil incarnate.
Mm-hmm.
He's playing a part. Okay,
Yeah.
this
Like.
this this time when this happens with Kiss and then Black Sabbath too,
Mhm.
automatically starts. Everybody thinks, well, if you're into heavy metal, you're into demon music. You know,
Yeah. And
finger pointing is all I can say.
again, another good example, Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper, at least from what I've seen, does some like really freaky stuff, and yet he's a born again Christian. Same with
His
same
father
with
was a preacher, and I believe he is also a preacher.
same with
He's
Dave Mustaine of
same, yes,
Megadeth.
he saved
Same, at
Dave
least
Mustaine.
nowadays, with Blackie Lawless of Wasp.
Yeah. So let's just say when you're going to be rich and famous and you're going to Hollywood, or if you're doing it as a actor, or you're doing it as a musician or any type of performer,
Mm-hmm.
whatever part or whatever idea you're playing, that is the part, you know. Uh, a lot of times people project. You see Mark Hamill, that's Luke Skywalker. You see Gene Simmons, that's the devil. You see a famous TV actor, you always associate him with that part. Okay. And sadly, sometimes the projection, you can never get rid of it. You know,
Yeah,
Mark Hamill, no matter what he does, is always going to be referred to as Luke Skywalker.
exactly. Which
You
is
know,
both a blessing and a curse. Let's be
it's a
honest.
blessing and a curse. Kiss is the same way. But Kiss also had a blessing in disguise. They can go into a stadium that they're getting ready to do a live performance, and nobody knew who they were without the makeup. So they can walk through the crowd, nobody ever know it, go into the back, put the makeup on, perform, take
Mm-hmm.
the makeup off, get in street clothes, and no one be the wiser. They weren't Elvis, where Elvis couldn't go out. Elvis couldn't go to a restaurant. Elvis couldn't go shopping.
Right.
Elvis had to pay money to have the store stay late at night so he can go into a store.
Mm-hmm.
Kiss,
Baron saying this is the problem with that rock and or roll
they,
fake devil worshippers.
yep. Uh, but yeah, Kiss did not have that problem. And the funny thing is, think about this, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
You would think your news, your paparazzi would be trying to get a picture of Kiss without the makeup. Now,
Mm-hmm.
gradually in the future, we'll see that they partially did here and there, but at their popularity right now, where we're talking about up until probably 78, there was nothing. Nobody knew who they were.
And
Could you
that's
imagine that going today? A band like Kiss would pop up today and you couldn't tell who they were.
mm-hmm.
They would be discovered within a heartbeat. So, like I said, the makeup could also, damn you with some people for believing that they're devil worshippers, but also that makeup was a lifesaver because at their height of popularity, and trust me, they were the height of popularity in the 70s. You cannot say the 70s without saying Kiss.
True.
They could do things that they could afford where their popularity didn't hinder them. Where other people in rock and roll or television or movies, these people couldn't do this stuff out in public. They couldn't go to a local McDonald's, sit down, and have a meal. Kiss could do that.
Right.
So,
But getting off of that tangent now and going back to talking about their albums, Rock and Roll Over. Um, that to me was a return to form for Kiss, where maybe, at least in my mind, Kiss realized, okay, we got a little too experimental with Destroyer, and our diehard audience didn't like it that much. Let's at least try and please both sides. We have the diehard fans that just want our straight, just point A to point B rock and roll. But then we have these new fans, that like Destroyer. Let's try and do both. And to me, that's what this album is, and it succeeds.
well, there's two reasons why that is, and I'll agree with you on what you said.
Real quick, though, we got to respond to what Baron says here. The
ABBA.
70s was ABBA's
I wouldn't
decade.
even give you, Baron, the decency to answer that or reply to that. ABBA. Can you name me 5 ABBA songs?
let's face it, how do people know about ABBA these days?
Yeah.
Mamma Mia. That's how.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll just forget about what Baron put there. He
Yeah.
demented right now. But you would have to say this album, the reason why it's different, and it seems like it's bringing Kiss back to being Kiss. Eddie Kramer, the producer. Eddie Kramer was the first person to produce Kiss's demos, which became Kiss' first album, to shop around to get a record deal. This
Right.
is, and then he did Alive. He's the one that was the producer of Alive. But now they got Eddie Kramer to do a studio album.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say this right now, Eddie Kramer is the best producer that Kiss has ever had.
It certainly sounded like
Definitely
it.
over Bob Ezrin, even though he was good in some. And there's one album we'll talk later on
Mhm.
another stream that was Bizarro World. Uh, yeah, I would say all the albums that have Eddie Kramer's are magical. He understood Kiss. He was able to get Kiss to do what they needed to do. And I think even from the very beginning, if it wasn't for Eddie Kramer, Kiss would probably took a lot longer to be discovered.
Right.
So,
This
but
album, I'm gonna give also an 8 out of 10, and and I didn't do this for the last. Actually, I did. I mentioned God of Thunder for the last album, but one track that I didn't mention for the last album, Destroyer, that is important for the future, is the album Detroit Rock City, which would later go on to be the title of Kiss's movie, which we'll talk about that around the 90s era, correct?
correct. There's
But
a lot of songs that was off the shore that's still getting played live by Kiss today.
yeah, but as
So,
far as rock and roll over, Dr. Love, easily.
Dr. Love. I will say for my rating of this album, I will say 9 out of 10. Uh my favorite song is I Want You.
Hmm.
I love that song. Uh and again, this is probably Kiss at its finest for me, rock and roll over.
Yes.
So, and Baron, can you name me the albums of all them songs that were on that you're listing? And I want you to show me on a stream all the ABBA albums that you own.
This be careful opening this can of worms, Phil.
Oh, you know me. I have no problems going there. But okay.
I know. I know.
Uh Next album.
Yep, the next album. Oh, and also, real quick, before we move on, Rock and Roll Over doesn't have anyone there that's not supposed to be. All four members are doing their thing the whole time, correct?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
God bless Eddie Kramer.
Love Gun, however, that's not true, sadly. Love Gun, if I'm not mistaken, is isn't that the first one where they start getting someone to replace Peter Criss?
No. No. Love Gun, you would say, is the last album where all members play their parts.
Right. But real quick,
And it's,
Baron, that's the wrong hashtag. It's not hashtag Phil is the devil. It's hashtag Phil is a good guy.
I hate you all. But Love Gun is also produced by Eddie Kramer.
Hmm.
Uh, I think Love Gun should be noted that this is the first album that Ace Frehley actually sings a
Yep.
song.
And it's the best song on the album in my opinion. Shock Me, which I'll go over this just real quick briefly. You told me this story about how way back in the day before the advent of wireless technology with sound systems, you had to like stand in this one spot on the stage and not move from that, otherwise you risk electrocution.
You can
And there,
move, but you are grounded in by a wire to your amp.
mhm,
Okay. Now, depending on how good your crew is, sometimes being grounded is not good.
Right.
And what happened to Ace Frehley was they have a big stage and they're walking down the stairs. And the stairs is pretty much solid
Metal.
metal.
Hmm.
Uh, when he gets to the bottom, whack, 240 bolts go through him like you wouldn't believe. Knocked him out. They stopped the show. Some people thought he was dead. Okay. 10 minutes after getting hit by 240 volts of electricity, and with the crowd chanting his name, Ace really jumps out, even though he can't feel his fingers, and goes back on stage, and they continue the show.
How's he able to play like that? Because as a guitar player, I'm trying to imagine not being able to feel my fingers. And here's the
Uh,
thing. I can somewhat understand, not being able to feel the fingers in your right hand, as a fellow right-handed person like Ace is.
mhm.
Because you can do stuff to make sure you can hold on to a pick. Yes, it takes some pressure to hold on to a pick like this, but they make picks where the plastic part goes over
Mhm.
your thumb and make sure you don't drop it. Mom has to use picks like that. But to not feel your fingers in your left hand, which is arguably doing more work, how in the world was he able to play like that?
I will say a couple reasons. One, you have the rhythm guitarist that can cover you. Paul Stanley is capable of covering him with his rhythm guitar, but Paul Stanley is able to play lead if he
That is
wanted to.
true.
So I think during that concert, Paul did a lot of covering where Ace was strictly not doing any rhythm chords. He was purely doing his leads.
Yes.
Uh, Another thing is, I couldn't tell you in the list of tracks during the concert where he got shocked. If it was towards the last, back in the day, Kiss only did 15 songs. That was the max they did.
Hmm.
So if they did at, he got shocked at say 8, 9, or 10, he only had 5 more songs to go at the minimum. So
Right.
not be that big of a deal.
But if it was like
So
at the very beginning, at the first song,
that's
Houston, we
totally
have a
different, you know.
problem.
So, but his feelings was afterwards. He had somebody tell him, people get shocked with 240 volts, survive, but only a week or two later to suffer a heart attack. So he was constantly scared for the next couple weeks, thinking he might drop dead at any moment.
Yeah. And the fact that he didn't is astounding.
Yeah.
But anyways, on to Love Gun. That's where the song Shock Me comes from. And in my opinion, it's the best song on there. And I'm gonna give this album another 8 out of 10. But as we already said, this is the last album that all four members are playing their parts.
On every track.
Yes.
I will give this album for me 8.5. And for me, and it's very hard to pick a good song, though there are a couple throwaways on this album. I will say Love Gun as my favorite song off this album.
Which, yes, a love gun is exactly what you think it is, for those
Yep,
wondering.
yep.
So that leads into Alive 2, which you said not only has live tracks, which I'll be honest, I didn't listen to
Hmm.
because, time constraints, but this also had some other studio albums that would have been right at home on, say, Rock and Roll Over and Love Gun, or could have been like the centerpiece of their own albums.
Yep. Again, the live part is good. Again, it's I believe three separate a combination of three separate concerts in California. Uh, but there is originally, if you got the records, there was 4 sides. Okay, on this Alive 2, the fourth side is 5 studio songs. On the
Yes.
cassette, you had 2 cassettes. On the fourth side was the studio tracks. This is where the ugly head of the session players pop out. Out
Mm-hmm.
of the 5 songs, Ace really only played one song, and that's his own song that he sings, Rocket Ride.
Right.
The other 4 is done by Peter Criss, Paul Staley, and Gene Simmons, but the guitarist on the other 4 songs is Bob Kulick. He's the one that plays them 4 songs.
Which
Uh,
doesn't he later actually join the band?
no, that's his brother. Originally,
Oh. Okay.
originally he was the forefront of getting the position as lead guitarist in Kiss at the audition, but then Ace really came in right after him, and that's the infamous one red Converse sneaker and one, I think, black Converse sneaker. Yeah,
Hmm.
and Ace really blew him away, apparently, and Bob Kulick lost the gig, and Ace really won it. So
Right.
things turn around. So Bob Kulick's going to play a important part in Kiss down the road, and his brother. So yeah, but he plays on here. Uh, I like the studio tracks, and I will say my favorite one is Rocket Ride. I love that song, and
Okay.
as an album as a whole, I will give it an 8 out of 10.
Right. So next after that then is all 4 solo albums. So
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, around this time, the band was really starting to not get along with each other and wanting to do different things. Is that right?
What was happening is Gene and Paul liked the idea album tour, album tour, album tour.
Hmm.
And Peter and Ace were more like, we can take a break. If we took
Right.
a year, it wouldn't have hurt anything. If we took 2 years, it wouldn't hurt anything. We don't need to do it. Mind you, remember, people, uh, you were getting 2 albums a year all the way up to this point. And I'm not counting the 2 originals 1 and originals 2. Kiss originals 1 and 2 is nothing but the first 3 albums in a collection set, so you can buy it cheaper. And originals 2 is the next 3 studio albums in a collection set. I don't consider that an official them 2 as an album, because they're just, even the covers was a sleeve that went over top, and the first 3 or the second 3 albums went into. So I don't
Right.
consider that an album. But there were also kinks because they were doing Kiss Meets the Phantom Park.
Hmm.
Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were on top of that. Ace and Peter did not want to do it. You have to remember, at this time, each member had a vote, and the tiebreaker was Bill Coyne. So everything went south at this time when they
It's
did Kiss
also
Meets the Phantom Park.
it's also worth mentioning that drug habits were starting to become a big
Yes.
problem.
Ace Frehley and Peter Criss did have their issues. At this point in time, Peter Criss's drumming starts going on a major decline. Okay. Uh,
And keep in mind, on the first Alive album, he sounds absolutely enormous on the
yes, he's a
drums.
beast. You can say all the way up to 77, he's a
Hmm.
beast. But from 78 to 79, when his last tour with Kiss,
Hmm.
it's gone. It's gone. It's
Yeah.
gone. Ace really might have been worse and had worse problems, but Ace really could still play his butt off live.
Oh yeah, and he's still, in my opinion, the most talented person of that band, at least of the original four members musically. In fact, I would go so far as to say that he's the most talented person of that band, full stop, considering all the members. The only person that could rival him, which we'll get to in part 2, is Eric Carr.
Yeah. Well, as this time, again, the Phantom of the Park, Peter Criss just walks out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So if you see Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, that's him in the movie, but that's not his voice. They actually had to get an actor, voice actor from Hanna-Barbera, and he covered his voice. Okay?
You'll have to, tell you what, we might have to do a watch party of this at some point, because I want to see it.
Okay, I warn you, it's not that great, but we'll do it.
Okay.
Originally, here's the problem with Kiss Meets the Phantom Park. Originally, that was supposed to, what was big at the time, Scooby-Doo meets such and such. It started in the 70s, late 70s when this came out.
Yep, I remember that.
This was supposed to be Kiss and Scooby-Doo. Somehow it got changed to a live motion picture.
Mm-hmm.
No Scooby-Doo, no gang, no nothing, but still kind of set and written in the set of Scooby-Doo. So that's why you get a lot of it's cringe. Eventually, 2014, we actually get the legit Kiss and Scooby-Doo. That took a long time to do it, but yeah, that was the original plan. And remember, Kiss Meets the Phantom Park is under the banner of Hanna-Barbera. They were very big with cartoons, and especially Scooby-Doo.
Right. So the solo albums themselves.
I have to speak on this real quick, and I don't mean to cut you off.
Oh, sorry.
The originally reason why they did solo albums, because when everything was wrapped up after Kiss Meets the Phantom Park, all four of the Kiss members and Bill O'Coin met in a trailer. And Peter Criss and Ace Frehley said, "We're done. We're done." And the only way to keep them to stay in Kiss and to keep the band going, Bill O'Coin came up with the idea, everybody go your separate ways, make a solo album, but we'll put it under the banner of Kiss.
Mm-hmm.
And they all went for it. So, again, Kiss could have ended right there in 77, 78.
And if they did, it would have still been an amazing career.
Yes, it would. So the big plan was 4 solo albums, and they were going to release, you can call it double platinum, but it is a greatest hits for that time. And they have not a remaster, they remade Strutter. And they called it Strutter 78, and it's played in a 78 times. So doesn't have that rock feel of 74 when it first came out. It's got a feel of 78
disco-ish.
Disco. So it has a little disco kick to it.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, but the original is just 10 times better because of that.
I do like the Strutter 78, but I will always stick with the original version. But I do like Strutter 78. It was nice to have something different on that album. So, and yes, we get to 4 solo albums.
Yes. Now, here's the order, just in case you're curious, here's the order that I listened to these albums in. And this is kind of going off of information you gave me, Phil, because certain members, and we'll get into which ones in a moment, kind of stray from the classic Kiss sound to do their own thing, while others You know, everyone's doing their own thing, but some sound like Kiss more than others. And by the way, hello, Mike. I hope Pop Talk was good. But here's the order that I listened to these albums: Gene first, then Peter Criss, then Paul Stanley, and then Ace Frehley, the best for last.
Okay.
Now, let me make this clear. None of these albums are bad. I like all of them. But the Gene Simmons album is not a, it sounds nothing like Kiss. It sounds like he honestly, he and Peter Criss both sound like they're both trying to sound like the Beatles. Peter Criss, maybe he sounds like he's trying to be like early Beatles. Gene Simmons sounds like he's trying to be later on Beatles. And for some reason, Gene Simmons decides to do a cover of the Disney song When You Wish Upon a Star. I mean, it's great, but why?
Ego. Let's just point out one thing on the solo albums as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
The album covers are all paintings of each member.
And they look
And
amazing.
I think they did an amazing job with them paintings. And I will have to say the Gene Simmons one,
Mm-hmm.
as far as the artwork and him on the cover, is probably the best out of all four.
I would agree.
Okay. So we're starting out with Gene Simmons, right?
Yeah, the Gene Simmons one. The Gene
Gene
Simmons
Simmons.
one.
Go ahead, you go.
I'm okay. I'm gonna go ahead and get it out of the way. 6.5 out of 10 for this one. Like I said, it's not bad, but it's the weirdest one out of all of them. And even though I questioned why he did it, oddly enough, When You Wish Upon a Star is kind of the best one, at least to me.
I will give you a real quick rundown on his solo album. It has
Mm-hmm.
to be mentioned. He has a lot of guest stars, and
Yeah,
particularly the one lady who plays Al Bundy's wife. I forget her name,
not a clue who that is.
but she actually plays. There's a song where they're acting like they're on the telephone,
Mm-hmm.
and that is her, the lady who plays Al Bundy's wife. Okay,
Okay.
he has a lot of guest musicians. Steve Perry from Aerosmith, I
Yep, I know
believe
who that
Eddie
is.
Van Halen.
What?
It's a
Eddie
who
Van
who.
Halen played with Gene Simmons.
Share. Let's put it to you this way: on Gene Simmons' songs when he did them as demos before Kiss
Uh-huh.
recorded them,
Mm-hmm.
Gene Simmons did his demos with Van Halen, not of course without David Lee Roth, but
Mm-hmm.
with Michael Anthony,
Eddie and
Alex Van
Alex.
Halen, and Eddie Van Halen. The demos were done with them.
That is
That's
shocking.
you have to remember. Gene Simmons discovered Van Halen,
Mm-hmm.
tried to get him a record deal. He did his darnest to get a record deal. And they told him if he couldn't give him a record deal in 2 weeks, their deal between him and them would be over. You know, but he tried, he couldn't get anybody to sign them. Believe it or not. Now,
Wow.
eventually, a couple years later, someone smart enough did sign Van Halen.
Mm-hmm.
But the person you can credit with finding Van Halen, Gene Simmons.
Yes.
So, but
And
yeah, if you ever get a chance to look at the back of the album or look up the information on the album, he got like 30 guest people on there. He
he went
even at that
overboard.
point flirting with Hollywood and famous people. So,
Right.
you
Pacific
can
said
see his
Kathy
mind.
Segal was Peg Bundy,
Yeah, you
and
can.
Baron. Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you. He says Eddie played with many people in groups. He was an awesome guitar player. See, the only person that I knew that Eddie played with outside of his own band was Michael Jackson. So I
No.
had no clue that he
No.
did anything with Gene
He
Simmons.
did demos with Gene Simmons for a couple Kiss songs. It did
Hmm.
not mean it ended up on a Kiss album.
Right,
I'm talking about the songs. When someone makes a demo of a song, it not
hmm,
necessarily has to be with members of the actual band. So
right,
he makes the demos, takes the demos to Kiss, and then says, this is the song. What do you think? What do you want to change?" So,
right.
but Gene Simmons was out there. Okay.
Hmm.
Uh his album, I only track I can say I really like is Radioactive,
That
but
one's all
I
right.
like the original Radioactive song when it was on Rock and Roll Over. I think the Rock
Hmm.
and Roll Kiss version of Radioactive is better than the Gene Simmons
Right.
Radioactive. But I would say I'll be a little bit more fair. I'd give him 7 out of 10.
Okay.
You know, it was bizarre.
And
Bizarre.
then the Peter Criss album, like I said, it sounds like he's just trying to sound like the Beatles. And the
Well,
one
there's
thing,
a little hidden reason behind that.
yeah.
The producer of his album, Vince, don't hold me to the pronunciation,
Hmm.
Ponka or whatever. He was a writer with Ringo Starr after he left the
Oh,
Beatles.
okay.
So, and Peter Criss, as much as everybody else in Kiss, was very influenced by the Beatles. But
I can
on his
tell.
solo album, yes, it had Beatles-ish. He had a lot of jazz, or
Yeah.
what you would call big band era songs. So
Which,
it was really bizarre, but that's what age. Remember, he's the oldest member in Kiss.
hmm,
He grew up playing as, and he learned from a jazz drummer. So it's not surprising when you listen to it and you say, that sounds something my grandfather or my great grandfather would listen to.
right.
That's up his
And
alley, you know.
another thing I want to point out, and sadly for the Peter Criss album, no songs really stick out to me. They're all just kind of pretty good. But the one thing that sticks out to me in as Peter Criss's album, I think he has, honestly, out of all four members, the weakest voice, vocal, as far as singing goes. It's just a bit, like, he's good, it's just
Mhm.
a bit too thin for me.
I think this album reflects that Peter Criss, when he was firing on all cylinders
Hmm.
and in the Kiss mode, he was great.
Yes.
By himself and
Yeah.
away and on his own,
Hmm.
not only is he destructive, which affects him, but let's just say if that was a Kiss album, he might have got one of them songs on the actual album. The rest of them would have been, nah, not as good for a Kiss album.
Yeah.
And you would
And then
have
the,
to say that was the album that has, if it's straying away from the Kiss template, that's the one. Mhm.
right.
But you
And
have to
then,
remember again, he's not really, yes, he does rock and roll, but he's more a jazz big band drummer. Okay? That's a
right.
different genre. So
And then,
we didn't
for,
give a track for that album. But can we agree all the tracks were pretty much the same? So
mhm. But then again, like I said, with this final score, I gave the Gene Simmons album a 6.5. I'm giving the Peter Criss one a 6. Like, yes, okay, I'm going to say it this way. Yes, the Gene Simmons one was weirder and more out there than the Peter Criss one, but that's what makes it more memorable, at least to me, than the Peter Criss one.
you're a little
So,
bit
Peter,
more nicer. I would give Peter Chris's album, which I do like,
mhm,
but it's to me it's not a Kiss album.
no,
I would say 5 out of 10.
right. And
And
then
I, it's a shame. It could have been better, but it is what it is.
Right. And then the Paul Stanley album, honestly, it's Paul Stanley. We already knew that by this point he was a great singer, a great guitar player, and his, I would say, comes in second place between the four as
And
far as sounding the most like a Kiss album. So I give him a 7 out of 10.
okay,
But
I can see that. Myself, I would give it an 8 out of 10. I
mhm,
like this solo album. The guitarist is the ghost guitarist, Bob Kulick again.
mhm,
On that album, does a wonderful job. Uh, I will say this: if you're putting the Kiss template, he's right on the money with the Kiss template.
right.
Okay, not Ace really took it to outer space with his, but the other two, they're nowhere near the Kiss template. If you would take Paul Stanley's solo album and named it as a Kiss album, and all four members were playing just their instruments and not doing any vocals, you would say that's a Kiss album.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the Ace Frehley album, by far and away the, at least in my opinion, and this is not just me being biased as a guitar player, in my opinion, the Ace Frehley one is just objectively the best. Like, I give that one a 9 out of 10.
I agree with you, and I will also give it a 9 out of 10. My favorite song on there has to be New York Groove, even though he didn't write that song and that's a remake. And originally he did not want to do it. But the magnificence of this record is the choice of producer, Eddie Kramer. Okay. Now, the magical thing about the four solo albums, they all went platinum.
hmm
Okay. Now, stop and think about that. As much as we put Gene Simmons and Peter Chris's album as being not as great, all four solo albums sold 1 million copies.
Right.
You
And
you can't name another band that could do something like that. Maybe the Beatles. Maybe the Beatles.
and let me ask you this. Would you say around this point Kiss stops being strictly a band and starts becoming more about the brand name than the actual band?
This is 76. Well, you can say
78.
it's the end of 75.
Yeah.
75 to 79, there is no question as far as music, albums, and memorabilia, there was nobody better. Okay.
Right.
That's even putting Star Wars there.
Which is
Kiss
shocking.
had it. Yes. Kiss outdid Star Wars when it come to memorabilia.
hmm
Okay. If Kiss would have ended right after these solo albums or even before these solo albums, them guys never have to work again and would still be surviving as they are now,
Yeah.
just on the memorabilia alone. Lunch boxes, posters,
Action figures.
t-shirts, uh, dolls, I guess I said lunch boxes, but belt buckles.
Signature guitars.
Uh, the one thing that they used to do, which was a good gimmick, after Alive, they start inserting something in the record sleeves. Love Gun actually had a love gun. Okay. Dynasty and Unmasked actually had a poster. Okay. I believe Rock and Roll Over, or it could have been Destroyer, had tattoos. Not permanent ones, but
hmm
tattoos. There was always something inside more than just it was Jack in a eating a box of Jack in a Box. There's always that little toy.
Yeah.
Same thing. Kids were
But
smart enough to do it. I think they were making more money merchandise wise than they were even doing records.
right. But just look at what I have on the screen here. Ivan, this is Paul Stanley's, one of Paul Stanley's signature guitars that he has currently with Ibanez. They are still making new variants of the same model for him. And you know that just like with any signature model, um, anytime someone buys one of these guitars, Paul Stanley gets a cut because his name is on it.
It was the same with Peter Criss and Pearl drums.
Yeah,
Same with Gene Simmons, and especially Ace Frehley.
yeah. Ace Frehley.
Remember, I showed you his Gibson guitars. Some of them
I'm gonna pull it
Gibsons
up right now. I mean, just look. This okay. Now, sadly, they don't make the Ace Frehley guitars brand new anymore. But this one is a copy of Ace Frehley's guitar from 1997. And of course, you zoom in up here on the headstock, and you see Spaceman there.
Yep. The true Spaceman.
Yeah.
Okay, and since this is technically part of the solo albums and everything, and it's very important in their makeup, we have to state this. Kiss licensed their makeup. They actually got a Supreme Court decision to make sure, now the Supreme Court, believe it or not, that they own the rights. Each member at that time, all four members, owned their makeup and that image.
Right.
Okay.
And I believe this was spawned on from believe it or not, Alice Cooper at the time using stage makeup very similar to theirs,
Yeah.
and they thought, hey, he's cramping our style.
Yep. So they made sure they got their rights. No one can trample on them rights for them things. I am not sure, but I can almost guarantee there's a one for the Bandit, so no one can go out there and use the Bandit image that belongs also probably guaranteed to Paul Stanley.
Right.
We'll talk about two other people with different makeup.
Yeah.
They might have different makeup, but their properties are owned by Kiss, in particularly Gene and Paul.
Yeah.
And the two currently wearing the cat and the spaceman makeup.
Those are
That's
not Peter Criss and
and
Ace
no,
Frehley.
no, no. And let's do it real quick. Peter Criss in 1980 as a separation deal sold all the rights to his makeup. Now he kept 25% ownership of the band, but he had no voting rights. He had that 25% all the way until 1989, where he had some financial troubles, and Gene and Paul helped him out, and they bought his 25.
Right.
Ace really is a different beast. Ace really, when he left in 82, uh, sold his rights to the band, but he got profits from 82 all the way to 86 as if he
Right.
was still a member of the band. But he kept his makeup rights. He kept his makeup rights all the way until the band got the original four got back together. When
Yes.
he signed his contract, and technically as an employee, Kiss bought the rights, not outright. What happened is
The
similar.
ability to use, right?
The way to explain it is pretty much similar to Dr. Pepper. Coke manufactures Dr. Pepper, but Coke does not own Dr. Pepper. It's licensed by Dr. Pepper to Coca-Cola. So every time Coke is making Dr. Pepper is getting a cut. Okay?
Right.
What that cut is, I don't know. But they get paid. Ace really technically still owns his makeup, but Gene and Paul have the rights to use this makeup.
At
Now,
but Ace gets paid for that.
Ace gets paid, but he does not have a say on how they use his makeup. But also, when he left, a year after he left, he actually did a Dunkin' Donuts commercial in Kiss makeup, and Kiss couldn't stop him.
Hmm. So yeah, basically the guys that are there today, Eric Singer is now the cat, and Tommy Thayer is now the spaceman, and we'll talk about those, I guess, at the final parts of
Yep.
this series and why
So
Phil hates them,
there
specifically
is
Tommy Thayer.
another album, technically never released in the United States. It's called The Best of the Solo Albums. That was a foreign release, but it is a collector's item. So
Yes.
it's pretty much 3 songs from every band member on one album.
Hmm.
So
And then moving on, here's
yeah,
where the Brown stuff really starts hitting the fan, as
yeah,
far as the band themselves. Disco.
Disco Kiss.
Hmm. Now, I got to be honest with you, and I told you this already today, but when you were talking about this album, kind of giving me the rundown of what to expect, I had it sort of hyped up in my head that this was going to be like disco and nothing but from Kiss. Like, Kiss are completely abandoning their old sound. They're going to sound nothing like Kiss except for, it's clearly their voices. And it's just going to suck. Thankfully, that's actually not the case. Yes, there is a greater disco influence on this album. But at the end of the day, it still sounds like Kiss. And honestly, for the most part, all of the studio albums to this point, and this is not bad, this is good consistency, but all of the studio albums more or less have kind of the same sound. And so by this point in my journey through listening to them, I'm kind of glad that they did change their sound because, hey, it's something new. But at the same time, I can see why the diehard fans back in the day when this album first came out tore this album up. So for me, personally, I'm giving this an 8.5 out of 10. And let's face it, this if it weren't for this album, we wouldn't have had the song I Was Made for Lovin' You, Baby, which, disco or not, is one of Kiss's best songs, wouldn't you say? Phil, you there? Hold on a second. Something ain't right.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. Uh, Dynasty. I agree with most of what you're saying, but as Kiss fans at this time, a lot of diehards, this was a betrayal. Now,
Hmm.
granted, this album did go platinum. Okay.
Yes.
Uh, the tour was one of the worst that Kiss at that point, and especially with the original band. Normally, they were used to maybe doing 3 shows in Philly, three
Yeah.
shows in New York. Here, they were doing maybe one sellout show,
Hmm.
one partially near a sellout, and in some cases, the concert hall was half full. Okay.
Right.
Now that wasn't everywhere they went, but that was the range of what was happening.
Hmm.
And at this time, you're getting little kids coming to a Kids concert, as opposed to teenagers.
Which again plays into the Detroit Rock City movie that we'll talk about later.
This will play a part in hurting Kiss and helping Kiss, because
Yes.
them kids that they are cringing on, 5, 7, 10 years old, in the
Hmm.
next decade is what's going to be their saviors with their fans, because it's them people that take up the Kiss banner later down the road.
Exactly.
Okay. As far as the chink in the armor, this is an album where Peter Criss shows up on the cover, but he only plays on one song, his own song.
Yep,
Other than
Dirty
that,
Livin',
he does not play on there. Uh,
which,
it has to be brought up. His producer on his solo album, Kiss used his producer on this album, and
uh-huh.
he was the one who decided Peter Chris's drumming was inferior, which caused Kiss to go to Anton Fig, who later becomes part of David Letterman's band.
Oh, and also he's still active even
Yeah,
today with Joe Bonamassa,
yeah.
who, by the way,
He
if you haven't heard of him, Phil, look him up. He's amazing.
he also plays on future solo albums of Ace Frehley. So
Uh-huh.
he does play a part, in the future. And according to, we'll wait till we get to the next album, and I'll tell you the little secret there. Uh, let's say this about this album. This is where Gene Simmons has the most minimum to a Kiss album. He only has two songs:
Yeah.
X-Ray
With
Eyes and Charisma.
no, wait, hold on. He was sing. What did he singing on "I Was Made for Loving You, Baby"?
That is that's Paul Stanley, and it's called "I Was Made for Loving You." It's no baby.
Still,
It's okay. It's
that
okay.
it sounded a lot like Gene Simmons.
But you get Gene Simmons with only two tracks, Peter Criss one,
Uh-huh.
but the big improvement is Ace Frehley with three, I believe.
Yeah, Ace between this album and the next one does quite a bit, and it is a great thing because Ace's songs between this album and the next are honestly the best songs.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, my favorite is "I Was Made for Loving You, Baby," but I do acknowledge that all of the Ace Frehley songs on Dynasty and when we
Before a
get to
Kiss
it on
fan,
Mask.
before a Kiss fan gets on you, Paul, it's "I Was Made for Loving You." Don't say
I'm
baby.
sorry, okay? You're gonna bear with me on this, okay?
Kiss fans are worse than Star Wars fans. They will come hunt you down, Paul.
Just like those old ladies did with
For
the whole
Elvis,
Elvis
yeah.
is dead
Yeah.
thing. But yeah, like I said, Ace Frehley songs between this one and Unmasked are the best. And so,
I
like I
would
said,
have to agree. I would have to
I
agree.
give Dynasty an 8.5 out of 10. I think as someone that's not a lifelong Kiss fan, that's just been listening to these albums within the span of a couple days, I've actually welcomed the change, but I can see why others would not.
And what's your favorite track?
I Was Made for Loving You.
Okay. For me, I do like all the songs. They're all, for me, okay for what they are. But my favorite track is Gene Simmons' Charisma. I love that track. And even though I'm not a great fan of Dynasty, I have to give the album its due. I will give it a 7.5.
Right.
Okay. It is what it is, and I give Kiss credit for taking what was going on in the moment and making it Kiss.
Exactly.
So,
And then that spawns into Unmasked. And let's just get this out of the way right now. Even though Peter Criss, his image is on the cover, he doesn't do anything on this album, and I have
one
some
thing he
feelings
does
about
do,
that.
the
Well,
one
hold on,
thing he does,
I'm not done yet.
right, go ahead,
I'm
go
not
ahead.
done yet. I'm sure he does some stuff. I'm
Mhm.
sure, but if he's not going to do anything on the album, whether by his choice or whether it's just a track record of the studio producers being like, you're not cutting it, Peter, but we're going to get someone else. At that point, why even consider him a member of the band? Just, hire whoever it is that's, like, at the time, why couldn't Kiss have just hired Anton Fig to outright replace Peter Criss, both in the studio and on stage? Why continue to drag along what was at the time, and no offense, Mr. Criss, if you're watching this, but Peter Criss at this time, let's be honest, was dead weight. So why continue to carry around that dead weight?
Baron, all I can say is justice for Phil McCracken.
Hashtag Phil is a good guy.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm going to explain to you what was all going on. Okay, during the Dynasty tour,
Mm-hmm.
Peter Criss was doing things that was detrimental to the band, and what I mean by that, actually sabotaging shows where he would sabotage the songs, be drunk on stage, speeding up songs, slowing them down. Remember, the drummer's the one that keeps the tempo.
Yes.
And the band after that tour pretty much wanted him gone.
Mm-hmm.
They gave him a chance to take some time. They gave him 3 months to clean up and to get his act together as a drummer.
Yes.
They brought him back. And as they brought him back, they had him play not just any songs, Kiss songs, typical Kiss songs. And from what it was been told, he failed miserably. He couldn't even play his own drumming tracks.
Because he was
So,
that strung out on drugs, or was it
drugs,
attitude?
alcohol, and let's just say lack of effort. I'm a superstar. I don't need to worry about practicing. I don't need to keep my skills going. And sabotaging a live performances like he was doing towards the end of that tour, you
Mm-hmm.
can't blame him. So they had a meeting at the end of that tour with the manager, Bill Coyne,
Mm-hmm.
and the three members, Ace, Paul, and Gene, voted him out. So his, like I said, his deal was he kept getting paid. He still owned 25% of Kiss. He ends up owning it all the way up until 1989 till Gene and Paul buys him out.
Yeah.
Uh, and pretty much by the time Unmasked is coming out, just his image is there. The only thing he did for this album was he was supposed to do, and he did do, the video for the track Shandy. That is
Mm-hmm.
his last time in Kiss. And then after that, you don't see him until the Unplug. Okay.
Right.
Now, Anton Fig, for one day, was a member of Kiss.
Mm-hmm.
One day. But they decided against it the following day. They just, how can I put it? It wasn't because he has an accent and he was from South Africa or his drumming. That had nothing to do with that. His look didn't fit in the Kiss mold. Okay?
Yeah.
Good for Kiss, maybe. Bad for Kiss, I don't know. But after the studio album was done, that's when Kiss goes and hold auditions for a new drummer. And their particular aim was an unknown drummer, not a recycled drummer from another band, previous band, or touring band. They were looking for somebody that was totally unknown.
Right.
Hence, we get Eric Carr, which we'll
And
discuss in the next part. But Unmasked is the first time Kiss puts a studio album and does not tour the United States. They tour Australia, which was a big tour, popular tour. It was huge. And they tour Europe. They only did one concert in the United States, and that was to introduce Eric Carr as their new drummer. I wish there's a video of that because the concert actually starts with Peter Criss playing drums. And then halfway in the show, the stage goes dark, and voila, you see Eric Carr, and he is announced as the new drummer of Kiss.
Right. And and yeah, when we get to especially Creatures of the Night, that's like the one I'm looking forward to the most.
Now, this album, Unmasked, is the first album technically that has keyboards in it. And
I noticed that.
The keyboards nobody knew for the longest time is Holly Knight. Holly Knight is a woman that is a known keyboardist, but she is a known songwriter. She wrote a lot of songs for a lot of different people. But on this, she was a keyboard player. She actually kept the $500 check she got for doing keyboards on this album, and she has a picture of it, and she posted the picture that she still has of that check.
Wow.
Nobody knew that she played keyboards up until maybe 2019. So there's a little Kiss thing there.
Okay.
But this is a decline for Kiss.
Yes.
Because it goes back, they didn't go platinum, this went gold. And that's the first time an album from the era of Kiss didn't go past gold since Dress to Kill.
Right.
Okay? Now, there's a lot of reasons for it. As I stated, there was no tour for this, there was no support in the United States for this. So, yes, it was a decline. But if you're not at that time when bands were releasing an album, you had to tour to support it. They still managed to make it a gold record. So there is a little kudos there. I think had this album had a tour in the United States, I think it could have reached platinum. I do like this album a lot. It is one of my favorite Kiss albums. But I think it would have done even more had it been a little bit more heavier than what it is.
I agree.
But I will say Ace Frehley's guitar solos in all this album is magnificent.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Ace Frehley. I'll be honest, before even diving into or even thinking about actually sitting down and listening to Kiss, had just written off the band as, I'll be honest, a gimmick. It was more about the makeup and the showmanship than it was the actual music. And I'll be honest, I have never been so glad to be proven wrong. Like, these guys aren't just, makeup caked faces on an album. They can play, and they play well, especially Ace Frehley.
Yep.
And
give them credit, they can write songs. Now,
granted, they can.
Granted,
it's about one subject, but still, they do it well.
But you can say they never had a number one hit song. Okay. But these guys, for the most part, yes, there are some cover songs here and there. And yes, they had some people that have written songs with them. But these guys have been able to write songs and capable of writing known hits.
Yeah.
So I will say music wise, would I say these guys are better than Black Sabbath music wise or Led Zeppelin?
Not even close.
Or Deep Purple? No. But for what Kiss is and their sound, I would say they're just as good as any other band out there that you can think of. So
yes.
But again, they're not pros. They're not the greatest. So
right. And by the way, hello to Nova Vaughn, who says Paul and Gene were geniuses in their craft. They were, but I'm sure we're going to get into even further. We didn't really touch on it on this one, but Paul and Gene have some pretty egregious controversies attached to them, we'll say.
Yeah.
We didn't touch them now because they haven't happened yet, at least in this portion of the timeline, but some bad things happen. Right, Phil?
I think we can take the next 5 minutes real quick, and we can just.
Well, hold on. I haven't given my
Oh, I'm
ranking.
sorry, I forgot about that. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you for reminding
So
me.
my
Remember, I'm
ranking,
old.
it's all right. My ranking for Unmask is 7 out of 10. And I would say She's So European is probably best track of the album. And again, just like I said with the last album, all the songs that Ace does are the best ones.
Agreed. For me, there's two songs that stand out, and I love all the tracks. I love Tomorrow, and I love I Found Out What Makes the World Go Round. I think if them songs were released today by Kiss, they would be instant hits. That's how
Yes.
good I feel about them two songs. Album as a whole, and I'm a little particular to this because I really do love this album. I would give it 8.5, though I understand every criticism of this album that it is more pop. And let's just say, even though the studio tracks are great, it's more whatever band member is singing that song is doing everything on that song minus the drumming. So Ace
Right.
Frehley and Anton Big are pretty much the guys doing Ace's songs. Paul Stanley, Anton Big on Paul's songs, and Gene and Anton Big on the Gene Simmons songs.
Right.
Again, it's this disunity. A lot of people, you have to remember, Kiss is good at smoke and mirrors. Okay, Dynasty is proof of that. Unmask is proof of that. You think you're listening to a Kiss album, you're listening to all four members playing their parts, and that's not the case.
Right. And I
So
wish it was.
it
But
really does, really do.
yeah.
But let's take the last few minutes before we call it. We have three more parts coming.
Yes.
So, what the future holds in the second part, I want to cover what I would call the Eric Carr era, or what a lot of people call the non makeup era, which
Yes.
technically is not the case because Eric Carr wore makeup and Benny Vincent did wear makeup. But
Yes.
it will cover from, let's just say, we will talk about the Unmasked tour because that's Eric Carr's first tour with the band. But then we're going to talk about the albums from The Elder all the way to Revenge. And technically, Revenge is another album quasi because Eric Carr is not playing on it, even though he sings a part of song on one
Yeah.
track and he
By
plays
that
drums
point,
on the other.
yeah, by that
So,
point, it's Eric Singer.
yes. And there's a whole bag of worms when that comes into. But I
Yeah.
will say this for people: the '80s version of Kiss with Eric Carr and Bruce Kulick and Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley is my favorite version of Kiss. And I have seen every version of Kiss minus the Tommy Thayer Eric Singer.
Right.
So, and I have no hatred towards them too, but for me, I'll explain the reasons later at another time.
Yes.
But
And
yes,
one other thing I want to mention too, and we will go into more detail about this with part 2. But yes, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, they are the biggest driving force of Kiss. They are incredibly talented musicians, but they are not good people. If certain stories are to be believed, which we'll get into in part 2, they have done some pretty shady stuff.
Yeah. Let's just say people tend to be the same as, well, a band, be honest, is no different than a marriage.
Hmm.
The difference is, instead of being married to one person in a band, you're married to two or three or even four or even more.
Hmm.
So you have to understand, very few bands are capable of getting together and staying together.
Yes.
So
The
yeah.
only band that I can think of that has done that is ZZ Top. When you had Dusty, Billy Gibbons, and Frank Beard, and they lasted the entire time until literally Dusty's passing, which I believe was 2 years ago.
Yes. I remember a time in the 70s and early 80s before they had the fully grown beards that they had.
Hmm.
Uh, but I'm talking about ZZ Top. And
Yeah,
believe it or not, ZZ Top had one time opened for Kiss too. So even though
I believe
they're
it.
an older band, so
Wow.
for me, like a lot of people don't notice, Alice Cooper was a band before it was a man. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that, yes, the guy who plays Alice Cooper, as we know Alice Cooper, yes, he uses the name Alice Cooper, but the band, there was an actual band, the first people he was playing with, all owned the rights to Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper to this day has to pay the original members $50,000 a year for the use of the name Alice Cooper.
Yeah.
And he didn't become Alice Cooper the man until like 74 or 75.
Right.
So that's how things change. And sometimes it gets swept under the rug. A lot of people don't even know that. So,
Hmm.
but yeah. Well, like I said, there's a lot to cover with Kiss. Unfortunately, we had to break it into 4 parts because it's impossible to do it even in 2 parts, let alone 3 parts. So down the future, in a couple of weeks, we'll come back and we will discuss the 80s Kiss.
Yes.
And
So,
I want to thank you, Paul,
no
for
problem.
joining me. Even though you were a little too bossy and I'm going to sick cash on you. Uh,
Cash doesn't scare me.
okay. Baron's going to say, I'm going to sick Baron on you. But okay. Yeah, you know I'm teasing. You
I
know I'm
know.
teasing.
Yeah.
Uh, oh,
And
go
yeah,
ahead.
thank you for getting me interested in a band that otherwise I really would not have cared that much about.
Well,
It's again another case like it was with Black Sabbath, where had it not been you being passionate about this band, I would never have listened to them.
gotcha. And know what? Yeah, I reached 50 subs, but
Woohoo!
thank you. But yeah, it's not a big deal to me. Yeah, thank you everybody. That was a 50 subs, but yeah, you know,
Yep.
this is fun for me. Well, Paul, promote your channel.
Okay. So, um, I did say we were going to do a stream tonight discussing some certain rumors. Sadly, that is not going to happen tonight. Um, we were only, so I'll be honest, mom and dad are coming home tonight from their trip west. They're going to be home in a little less than an hour. So they're going to want to see me. So I don't think there's enough time I have for a stream. So we're not going to have any streams tonight on the Star Wars guys or the Everything Else guys. So Monday, I think what we're going to do is Monday we're going to have another Skyrim stream where we will address these certain rumors and give our take on the validity of them. You can already guess what we're going to say, but I think since enough people are talking about it, I might as well, excuse me, throw my hat in the ring. But yep, this is Release McCracken and Phil. How do you feel about all of us?
I hate you all. But
Yep.
I'm going to plug one thing for me. Uh, I plan on doing part two with this kiss probably within 4 weeks because I don't like to stream too much.
Okay.
But in the near future, maybe within 2 weeks, I'm in talks with one legendary Cash Money of doing a special kind of late night streaming. So I have to go over more with him and get his input. And after that, I am in talks to trying to get the next person on Phil Talks. It's going to be another good one. Uh, I'm just waiting for them to be able to confirm when they can do it. And then we're going to bring him on to Phil McCracken and torture the person for an hour. So, yeah. But again, thank you everybody that came into the chat. I greatly appreciate it. Thanks again to Paul for joining me and helping me with this. And yes, everyone, I hate you all. I really, really hate you. Never forget that. And with that, have a good night and God bless. Good night, everybody.
Good night.